A town under the grip of a ruthless biker gang finds an unlikely protector in Daniel Briggs, a former soldier turned police officer and his loyal K9 partner, Shadow. When the Iron Fangs take Shadow as a warning, Daniel refuses to back down, igniting a brutal war with gang leader Mace. As tensions escalate, Daniel is forced to abandon the rules he once lived by, teaming up with the hardened Vietnam veteran Frank Mitchell to dismantle the gang from the inside. But power doesn't disappear, it shifts. With Mace gone, another threat rises in his place. Jared Cole, a more brutal and calculated enforcer who aims to rebuild the Iron Fangs empire. As Daniel and Frank strike first, they soon realize that eliminating one enemy only invites another, and Brookhaven's scars run deeper than they ever imagined. With the town divided, law enforcement reluctant to get involved, and new enemies waiting to seize control, Daniel faces the hardest decision of his life: continue the fight in the shadows or step forward and take responsibility for the future of Brookhaven. But when a new wave of bikers arrives, seeking to reclaim the territory left behind, Daniel understands one thing: the war isn't over, and the only way to stop it is to end it on his terms. The fight for Brookhaven has only begun. Hold on a moment before we move forward. Let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if you're loving these stories, don't forget to hit subscribe. Tomorrow's episode is going to be absolutely mind-blowing. The streets of Brookhaven were quiet at this hour, the kind of stillness that came only in the dead of night. The only sounds were the occasional hum of a street lamp, the distant wail of a siren miles away, and the steady purr of a police cruiser as it rolled slowly down the empty streets. Officer Daniel Briggs sat in the driver's seat, his hands relaxed on the wheel, his mind half drifting between exhaustion and the ever-present awareness that came with the job. He had been on duty for 12 hours, longer than usual, but he wasn't complaining. This was his life, the life he had chosen after the military, after the war, after too many ghosts had followed him home. In the passenger seat, Shadow sat tall and still, his large black frame illuminated by the dim glow of the dashboard lights. His deep brown eyes scanned the streets, his ears flicking at every distant noise, his body tense but still, always prepared, never fully at rest. He was like that even at home, always watching, always ready. Some things never leave a soldier, even when they no longer wear the uniform. Daniel reached over and ran a hand through the thick fur on Shadow's neck. The dog huffed in response, his tail flicking slightly, but otherwise remaining as alert as ever. "Almost home, partner," Daniel muttered, exhaling as he turned onto his street. "Almost time to relax." Shadow didn't relax. He never did until the job was truly done. The house came into view, a modest single-story home with a small yard, an old oak tree standing like a sentinel near the porch. It wasn't much, but it was his, a place where he could finally settle, where he and Shadow could exist outside the noise of their pasts. He pulled into the driveway, cutting the engine. Shadow's head snapped up. Daniel felt it before he saw anything, the shift in the air, the change in Shadow's body language. He was still, but his muscles were coiled, his breath heavier. "What is it, boy?" Daniel asked, his voice low. The dog didn't make a sound, but his ears were rigid, his nostrils flaring. Daniel followed his gaze toward the street. A motorcycle sat at the far end of the block, its engine silent, its rider obscured by the darkness. The streetlights weren't strong enough to catch the details, but Daniel could see the glow of a cigarette ember, the faint movement of a figure leaning back against the bike, watching. Daniel felt his gut tighten. He knew that kind of posture. It wasn't casual, wasn't some neighbor out for a late-night smoke. This was someone staking a claim, someone sending a message. He unbuckled his seatbelt slowly, keeping his eyes on the figure. Shadow's body tensed even more, a low vibration forming in his chest. "Easy," Daniel murmured, placing a calming hand on the dog's shoulder. The cigarette ember flickered, then dropped to the pavement. The rider crushed it under his boot, then swung a leg over the bike. The engine roared to life, a deep, guttural growl that cut through the quiet night like a warning. Shadow barked, one sharp, commanding sound, but the rider didn't flinch. He simply revved the engine once, twice, then peeled away, tires screeching against the asphalt before disappearing around the corner. Daniel exhaled slowly, fingers flexing against the steering wheel. He had been expecting this. It was only a matter of time. The Iron Fangs were watching. They had been a problem for a while now. Small incidents at first. A bar fight that turned bloody, a few businesses persuaded to pay for protection. Then it escalated. Assaults, arson. They were testing their limits, pushing to see how far they could go before someone pushed back. Daniel had pushed back. A month ago, he and Shadow had tracked one of their members during a burglary gone wrong. The chase had ended with Daniel tackling the suspect into the cold asphalt and Shadow's teeth locked onto the man's arm. The arrest had stuck. The gang hadn't forgotten. He sighed, rubbing his eyes. This wasn't going to go away on its own. Shadow let out another low growl, his head still turned toward the street, as if expecting the bike to return. Daniel patted his side, the cool weight of his service weapon a familiar presence. "Come on, boy, let's get inside." He stepped out of the cruiser, Shadow following close behind, his movements smooth and silent. They crossed the yard, Daniel's boots crunching softly against the gravel, Shadow padding beside him without a sound. Even now, even after everything, it was hard not to feel like they were still on patrol. Inside, Daniel locked the door behind them and set his gear down by the couch. Shadow did his usual sweep of the house, nose to the floor, checking every room before finally settling near the back door, where he would keep watch, as he always did. Daniel moved to the sink, filling a glass with water, then leaning against the counter. His hands were steady, but his mind wasn't. He had seen men like the Iron Fangs before. They didn't just disappear. They escalated. They found weaknesses, found ways to make people bend. They thought they could do the same to him. They were wrong. A knock at the door made him pause. Not loud, not rushed, just firm, deliberate. Shadow was on his feet instantly, standing between Daniel and the door, his ears rigid, his body a wall of muscle and instinct. Daniel set his glass down quietly and moved toward the door, his hand resting on the grip of his gun as he looked through the peephole. A man stood on the porch, tall, broad shoulders, a face lined with years of hard living, a leather vest over a black t-shirt, the emblem of a snarling wolf on his chest. Daniel's jaw tightened. Mace, the leader of the Iron Fangs. He'd seen the man's rap sheet, assault, extortion, weapons charges, nothing that had ever stuck for long. The kind of man who walked around knowing the law could only touch him so much. Daniel didn't open the door. Mace smirked, like he knew he was being watched. "Relax, Officer Briggs," he called through the door, his voice smooth as oil. "I'm just here to talk." Shadow let out a deep, warning growl. Mace glanced down at him, unimpressed. "That's a hell of a dog you got there. Good boy. Smart, too." He met Daniel's eyes through the peephole, his smirk widening. "Shame if something happened to him." Daniel's fingers curled tighter around the grip of his gun. Mace chuckled. "See you around, officer." He turned and walked back down the steps, disappearing into the night. Daniel exhaled slowly, every muscle in his body coiled tight. Shadow didn't move from the door, neither did Daniel. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The night had stretched into the early hours, and Daniel sat in his living room, the dull glow of the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Shadow lay at his feet, his ears twitching even in sleep. The encounter with Mace had left a bitter taste in Daniel's mouth, but he had seen men like him before. Predators who thrived on intimidation, who tested the limits of the law just to see how far they could go before they got a reaction. They were the kind of men who didn't take no for an answer. And now, Mace had made his intentions clear. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his short, cropped hair. He had learned long ago not to let threats get under his skin. He had dealt with worse. But when Mace mentioned Shadow, Something inside him had twisted. The dog wasn't just his partner. He was his family. He reached down, his fingers brushing against the thick fur on Shadow's neck. The German shepherd stirred slightly, lifting his head, those sharp brown eyes locking onto Daniel's as if sensing his unease. "It's nothing," Daniel murmured, "just another scumbag who thinks he can scare me." Shadow huffed in response, resting his head on his paws again, but keeping one eye open. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, carrying the distant hum of the highway. Daniel had never been the paranoid type, but tonight something didn't feel right. He got up and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see the street. Empty, nothing out of place, no lingering motorcycles, no figures in the shadows. But Shadow's growl returned, low and quiet. Daniel turned just as the dog rose to his feet, his body stiff, his ears rigid. A sound, faint, barely there. Then another. Daniel's heart pounded as he grabbed his gun off the table and moved toward the back door. The yard was still, the old wooden fence standing just as it always had. The night air was cold against his skin as he stepped out onto the porch. Shadow was beside him in an instant, his nose to the wind, his body coiled tight like a spring. And then the world exploded into chaos. A loud clang from the side of the house, metal against wood. A shadow moved, fast. Daniel's instincts kicked in before his mind could catch up. He raised his gun, stepping off the porch, ready to call out. But then he heard the van. A deep, guttural engine roared to life just beyond the fence. And Shadow was gone. The dog moved before Daniel could even react, a streak of muscle and black fur launching toward the fence with a speed that would have made any man hesitate. The wooden slats splintered as Shadow lunged over, disappearing into the darkness. A yell, a scuffle, a thud. Daniel ran. His feet barely touched the ground as he reached the fence, vaulting over it in a single motion. He landed hard, rolling to his feet, just in time to see the van's taillights illuminate the alleyway. The back doors were open. Shadow fought against two men, his jaws locked onto one's forearm, his body thrashing violently. The man screamed, trying to shake him off, but Shadow held on. "Shadow!" Daniel shouted, raising his gun, but he never got the shot off. The second man moved fast, a thick metal pipe in his hands. It came down hard against Shadow's side with a sickening crack, a yelp, short and sharp. Daniel's stomach twisted as Shadow faltered, his legs buckling, his body crumbling to the ground. "No!" The second man grabbed Shadow by the collar, yanking him toward the van. The first, still bleeding, scrambled inside. The doors slammed shut just as Daniel fired. The bullet punched into the rear bumper, sparks flying, but it didn't stop them. Tires screeched against the pavement. The van fishtailed before rocketing down the alley, disappearing into the night. Daniel sprinted after it, his lungs burning, his heart hammering. He pushed himself harder, faster, but it was no use. The van was gone, and so was Shadow. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel stood in the middle of the alley, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles ached. He could still see the fight playing out in his mind, the way Shadow had fought, the way he had collapsed, the sound of that pipe hitting bone. A deep rage burned in Daniel's chest, something raw and ugly, something he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just a message. This was war. His hands shook as he pulled out his phone, dialing with stiff fingers. "Harris!" came the groggy voice on the other end. Daniel forced himself to breathe. "I need you to run a plate." Silence. Then, fully awake now, "What the hell happened?" "They took Shadow." There was a pause. Then a sharp inhale. "Where are you?" Daniel turned, scanning the empty alley, his jaw clenched so tight it hurt. "They won't get far," he said, his voice cold. "Not from me." The call ended, and Daniel took a slow step forward, his gun still in his hand, his pulse hammering in his ears. He didn't know where they had taken Shadow. Not yet, but he would find them, and when he did, God help them. The night wind rattled the branches of the trees on the edge of town, sending dried leaves skittering across the cracked pavement of an old industrial zone long forgotten by most of Brookhaven. The air was thick with the scent of rust, oil, and decay. Streetlights had long stopped working here, leaving only the faint glow of the moon to illuminate the decrepit warehouses that loomed like sleeping giants, their broken windows jagged as old wounds. Tommy Mitchell, a 7-year-old boy with an explorer's heart, stood at the edge of the woods behind his grandfather's house, his small hands clutching the straps of his backpack. His mother had told him 100 times not to wander out here, that the abandoned buildings were dangerous, that bad people sometimes lurked where no one else wanted to go. But Tommy wasn't afraid. Not of the dark, not of danger. And tonight, something had called him here. At first, it had been just a sound, distant, barely there. A whimper, a low, broken noise that had sent a strange shiver down his spine. He'd been playing with his flashlight in the backyard, pretending to be an astronaut exploring an alien world, when he had heard it again. A dog. Tommy had always loved dogs, but his mother wouldn't let him have one. She said it was too much responsibility, that Grandpa Frank wasn't as fast as he used to be, and that a pet needed more than just love. But this dog, this sound, it was different, it was hurt. He glanced back toward the house, the lights glowing warmly in the distance. If he went inside now, his mother would tuck him into bed, and tomorrow the sound might be gone. The dog might be gone. Or worse. Gritting his teeth, Tommy took a breath and stepped into the trees, his flashlight bobbing as he walked. The wind whispered through the branches, and the deeper he went, the more the world felt different, wilder, bigger. He picked his way over fallen logs, his sneakers sinking slightly into the damp earth, his heart pounding harder with every step. And then he heard it again, closer now. A sharp, pained whimper, followed by the faintest rattle of metal. Tommy's stomach twisted. He moved faster, weaving between the trees until the woods gave way to a clearing, where the skeletal remains of an old warehouse stood, its steel frame rusting beneath the moonlight. He had never been this far before, but the sound was coming from inside. Swallowing his fear, he crept toward a hole in the side of the building where the metal had corroded away, leaving a gap just big enough for him to squeeze through. His flashlight flickered over the dusty floor, revealing long-forgotten tools, broken pallets, and puddles of stagnant water. The smell was worse in here, stale and heavy with something sour. And then he saw them. 4 men, big, leather jackets, shadows moving against the dim light of a single flickering bulb. They were gathered near the center of the warehouse, laughing in low, cruel voices, and chained to a post in front of them was the dog. Tommy's breath caught in his throat. It was a German shepherd, his dark fur matted with dirt and blood, his sides rising and falling in quick, pained breaths. He wasn't barking, wasn't even growling, just staring at the men with dark, defiant eyes. The biggest man, the one with tattoos crawling up his neck, knelt in front of the dog, tilting his head. "You're a tough son of a bitch, aren't you?" he murmured, almost admiringly. "Most dogs would have broken by now." He reached out and grabbed the dog's snout, forcing it up. "But you ain't most dogs, are you?" The shepherd didn't move, didn't flinch. Tommy knew he should run, that these weren't the kind of men he wanted to meet in the dark. But he couldn't. His feet were frozen, his hands gripping his flashlight so tight his knuckles ached. He had to do something. "Boss says we got one more night with him," another man said, flipping a knife open and shut. "After that, we make an example." Tommy's stomach twisted. He didn't know what they meant by example, but he knew it wasn't good. The shepherd must have understood too, because, for the first time, he let out a low, guttural growl. The tattooed man just grinned. "That's more like it." Tommy's hands trembled. He needed to get out, needed to tell someone. But the dog, he couldn't just leave him. His fingers brushed against his pocket. His phone. Slowly, carefully he pulled it out, keeping the flashlight low to avoid drawing attention. He swallowed hard and tapped on the contact list. His grandpa's number was at the top. He hesitated, then hit call. It rang once, twice. "Come on, Grandpa." A voice picked up, rough with sleep. "Tommy? What?" Tommy sucked in a breath and whispered as quietly as he could. "Grandpa, I need help. They took a dog." Silence. Then, in a voice Tommy had never heard before, steady and sharp as steel, "Where are you?" Tommy's fingers tightened on the phone. His heart was hammering so hard he was afraid they would hear it. "I'm at the old warehouse," he whispered. "There's men here. They hurt him." More silence, then a single command. "Stay low, stay quiet, and don't move." Then the line went dead. Tommy's hands were shaking now, his breath coming in fast, shallow gasps. He tried to tuck his phone back into his pocket, but in his hurry, his fingers slipped. The phone hit the concrete floor with a sharp clack. The laughter stopped. The men turned. The tattooed one narrowed his eyes. What the hell was that? Tommy's stomach dropped. He spun on his heel and ran. He didn't care if they heard him now. He didn't care about the flashlight bouncing wildly in his hand, about the shouts behind him. All he cared about was getting out, getting back to Grandpa, getting to someone who could help that dog. He slipped through the gap in the metal, his shirt snagging on the jagged edges, tearing as he tumbled onto the ground outside. Footsteps pounded behind him. "Get the little shit!" Tommy didn't look back. He ran. Branches whipped against his face as he crashed into the woods, his breath ragged, his legs burning. The flashlight slipped from his grip, vanishing into the underbrush. He didn't stop, didn't think, just ran, his mind screaming for home, for safety, for his grandfather. Then, headlights, blinding. A truck's engine roared as it skidded to a stop, gravel flying. The driver's door swung open, and in the harsh glow of the headlights, Tommy saw a figure step out. Not one of the men from the warehouse. No, this man was older, stronger, eyes hard as flint, locked onto the trees behind Tommy. Grandpa Frank, and in his hands, gripped with the familiarity of a man who had spent a lifetime holding it, was a rifle. Tommy stumbled forward, gasping. Frank didn't even look at him. He just raised the barrel, took aim, and said, "Come on, then." The trees were silent, then footsteps retreating, and the night swallowed them whole. Frank Mitchell stood in the cold night air, his rifle steady in his grip, his heartbeat slow and measured. He listened as the footsteps faded into the woods, swallowed by the darkness. They wouldn't be back, not tonight. He had seen men like them before, predators who thrived on fear, who took what they wanted because no one ever stopped them. But he had spent too many years in war zones to be easily intimidated, and he sure as hell wasn't about to let them take his grandson's courage away. Tommy clung to his side, his small chest heaving, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. Frank placed a firm hand on the boy's shoulder, grounding him, letting him feel the strength in his grip. "You did good, kid," he murmured. "Now, let's get home." They climbed into the truck, the headlights cutting through the dark as Frank turned the wheel hard, kicking up gravel as they pulled onto the road. Tommy sat silent, his wide eyes darting back toward the trees, half expecting those men to burst through at any second. But Frank knew better. They wouldn't try again tonight. "What did you see?" Frank asked after a long moment. Tommy swallowed hard. "A dog," he whispered. "A big one. They had him tied up." He looked hurt, Grandpa. Frank's grip tightened on the wheel. "A dog, a big one. That narrowed things down real quick. And if those bastards had a military-trained shepherd in their hands, there was only one man in this town they had taken it from. Daniel Briggs." Frank hadn't spoken to Daniel in years, not since he had come back from overseas and taken the badge. He wasn't the kind of man who asked for help, and Frank respected that. But tonight, the younger man wouldn't have a choice. They reached the house, a modest old place tucked against the woods, the porch light buzzing weakly. Frank parked, shut off the engine and turned to Tommy. "Inside, lock the door." But no arguments. Tommy hesitated, then nodded, slipping out of the truck and rushing up the steps. Frank waited until he heard the deadbolt slide into place before he pulled out his phone. His fingers moved fast, dialing a number he hadn't used in years. It rang once, twice, Then a voice, sharp, raw. "Mitchell!" Frank didn't waste time. "They took your dog." Silence. Then something cold in Daniel's tone. "Where?" "Old warehouse, past the industrial district," Frank said. "Tommy saw them there." Another pause. Frank could hear the barely restrained fury behind Daniel's breathing. Then, "I'm on my way." The line went dead. Frank slid the phone into his pocket and grabbed his rifle from the passenger seat. His knees ached when he stepped out of the truck, but he ignored the pain. He had spent most of his life fighting wars that weren't his to fight. This one was different. This one was personal. He moved back toward the house, stepping onto the porch where Tommy was watching him through the screen door, his small fingers gripping the frame. "Grandpa," the boy whispered, "are you gonna help him?" Frank looked down at him, saw the worry in his grandson's eyes, the uncertainty. The kid had seen too much tonight. He crouched, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I ain't letting those bastards win," he said simply. "Neither are you." Tommy blinked, his breath hitching. I was scared," Frank nodded. "Only fools ain't scared. But you ran when you had to. You got help. You did good." The boy chewed his lip. Then hesitantly, "What's gonna happen to the dog?" Frank exhaled, standing. "We're gonna get him back." Then, without another word, he grabbed his coat, stepped off the porch, and disappeared into the night. Daniel's truck skidded to a stop in Frank's driveway minutes later, dust swirling in the headlights. He was already out before the engine had fully died, his gun holstered at his side, his entire body thrumming with adrenaline. His face was tight, his jaw clenched so hard it looked like he might break his own teeth. Frank stepped down from the porch, watching as Daniel stormed toward him. "Where's Tommy?" the younger man demanded. "He's fine," Frank said. "Scared, but fine." Daniel exhaled through his nose, his fists flexing. "Tell me everything." Frank nodded toward the truck. "Get in." They drove in silence for the first few minutes, the only sound the steady roar of the engine. Daniel stared straight ahead, his knuckles white on the wheel. "I should have seen this coming," he muttered finally. "Mace showed up at my house earlier tonight, threatened Shadow. I told him to go to hell," Frank grunted. "They don't like being told no." "No, they don't," Daniel said darkly. Frank watched him out of the corner of his eye. The kid had always been tough, but this was different. This wasn't just anger, this was something deeper, something dangerous. "You ever lost a partner before?" Frank asked. Daniel's throat worked, but he didn't answer. Frank nodded. "Then you know." Daniel swallowed hard. "I'm getting him back." Frank didn't doubt it. The industrial district loomed ahead, the rusted skeletons of forgotten buildings casting long shadows under the moon. Daniel slowed the truck, pulling off a block away, cutting the lights. "We do this smart," Frank murmured, checking his rifle. "No running in blind." Daniel nodded tightly, his body practically vibrating with restrained fury. They stepped out, moving low, keeping to the darkness. The old warehouse loomed in the distance, just as Tommy had described. A single light flickered from inside. Frank scanned the area. "There," he whispered, nodding toward a rusted-out truck parked near the entrance. Two figures stood beside it, smoking, their laughter carrying in the still night. Daniel's jaw flexed. "We go quiet." Frank smirked. "I don't do quiet as well as I used to." Daniel shot him a look. "Then let me." Frank nodded, stepping back. Daniel moved fast, his footsteps silent, his body low. The first man didn't even have time to react before Daniel had an arm around his throat, dragging him back into the shadows. A quick, practiced chokehold, and the guy was out. The second turned just as Daniel lunged, his fist connecting hard with the man's jaw. He staggered, reaching for a knife, but Frank stepped in, bringing the butt of his rifle down against the side of his head. He crumpled without a sound. Daniel exhaled, his fists still clenched. "Inside," he muttered. Frank nodded. They moved toward the entrance, the weight of what was about to happen settling between them. They had both fought wars in different lifetimes, had both left pieces of themselves in places no one else would ever understand. But tonight, they weren't soldiers. Tonight, they were two men taking back what was theirs, and God help the bastards who got in their way. The night stretched long and quiet, the kind of silence that made men uneasy when they knew violence was waiting just beneath the surface. Frank Mitchell moved with a purpose, his old combat instincts flaring to life as he crouched behind a stack of rusted barrels near the warehouse entrance. Daniel was a few steps ahead, his body tight with fury, but he wasn't stupid. He was controlled, measured, the kind of man who didn't make reckless moves, even when everything inside him screamed to. Frank respected that. The two unconscious bikers lay slumped near the old truck, their bodies blending into the shadows. No alarms had been raised, no other men had come outside. That was good. It meant they still had the element of surprise. Frank scanned the building structure, the way the dim light inside flickered through the cracked windows. "Old factory," he murmured, more to himself than to Daniel. "Looks like the main floor opens up to a loading dock, probably offices upstairs." Daniel barely glanced at him, his eyes locked on the entrance. "We get in, we get shadow, and we get out, fast," Frank grunted, gripping his rifle. "Let's see how quiet we can keep this." Then Daniel moved first, slipping through the side entrance. The door creaked slightly as it opened, but inside, the laughter of the bikers covered the noise. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the acrid scent of stale beer. Frank stepped in behind Daniel, his rifle raised. The warehouse smelled of rust and sweat, of men who had claimed it as their own, a den for wolves who thought they were untouchable. At the center of the room, tied to a metal post with thick chains, was Shadow. Frank had seen war, had seen men beaten and broken, and what he saw in that dog's dark eyes was no different. Shadow was hurt, his fur matted with blood, his breathing slow, but he wasn't broken. No, he was waiting, and when his gaze lifted and met Daniel's, something inside him shifted. The German shepherd didn't whimper, didn't bark. He just stared, unwavering, a soldier waiting for orders. Daniel exhaled sharply. Frank saw his fingers twitch, that restraint on the verge of snapping. Then Mace's voice cut through the air. "I was wondering when you'd show." The bastard was sitting on an old wooden crate, legs spread, a cigarette dangling from his fingers. His leather jacket bore the Iron Fangs emblem, a snarling wolf, the stitching worn but proud. Around him, 6 of his men lounged, their postures loose, relaxed. They weren't afraid. They didn't think they had reason to be. Frank tensed, his rifle angled slightly downward but ready. Daniel didn't lower his gun. His jaw flexed, his breathing controlled, but Frank could feel the storm brewing beneath. Mace smirked, tapping his cigarette against the crate. "You know, Briggs, I figured you'd be smarter than this, walking right into my house without an invitation." Daniel's voice was steady, but Frank could hear the sharp edge beneath it. "Let him go." Mace chuckled, shaking his head. "Now see, I can't do that. That dog of yours? He embarrassed us. And you made it worse." He took a drag of his cigarette, exhaling slowly. "So, now we gotta make an example." Frank's grip tightened. His instincts screamed at him to move, to take the shot before things went sideways. But he held. There were too many of them. Too many angles. One wrong move, and they'd be fighting their way out against a pack of wolves. Mace flicked his cigarette to the ground and stood, rolling his shoulders. "Tell you what," he said, grinning. "How about we settle this like men? You and me, Briggs. No guns, just fists. You win, you take your mutt. You lose?" His smirk widened. "Well, I guess you won't be around to care." Daniel didn't hesitate. "Fine." Frank's head snapped toward him. "Kid." Daniel ignored him, stepping forward. Mace grinned, cracking his knuckles. "That's what I like to hear." One of the bikers stepped up, unhooking the chains around Shadow's neck. The dog slumped slightly but didn't move, his eyes still locked on Daniel. Mace shrugged off his leather jacket, revealing arms lined with tattoos. Prison ink, the kind that told stories in symbols only men like Frank could read, the kind that said he had earned his place through violence. The other bikers stepped back, forming a loose circle. Daniel rolled his shoulders, fists clenching. Frank could see the tension in his muscles, the way his body coiled tight. He wasn't a rookie. He had been in real fights, had taken real hits, but Mace was bigger, heavier, built for brawls that ended in men spitting blood onto concrete. The first punch came fast. Mace moved like a predator, throwing his weight behind a right hook aimed straight for Daniel's jaw. But Daniel ducked, shifting to the side, his own fist snapping forward in a sharp jab to the ribs. Mace grunted, staggering back slightly, but he grinned. "All right," he muttered. "Right, you got some fight in you." Then he swung again. Daniel took the hit this time, a solid shot to the side, but he didn't go down. He used the momentum, turning with it, slamming his elbow into Mace's jaw. The biker cursed, spitting blood onto the floor. Frank watched, tense, his rifle still ready. The other bikers were watching too, waiting, eager for violence. Mace wiped his mouth, his grin faltering. Then, without warning, he lunged. Daniel was fast, but Mace was faster this time. His fist connected hard with Daniel's ribs, followed by a brutal uppercut that sent the cop stumbling back. Frank stepped forward, his fingers flexing on the trigger. Not yet. Daniel steadied himself, exhaling sharply. Then he moved. He ducked under the next swing, his fist slamming into Mace's gut. 1, 2, 3 hits in quick succession. The biker gasped, his body folding slightly, and Daniel capitalized. His knee shot up, cracking against Mace's face. The big man dropped to one knee, blood dripping from his nose. The warehouse was silent. Mace blinked, dazed. Then he laughed, a low, breathless sound. "Well, shit." Daniel stepped back, his chest rising and falling heavily. "We're done here." Mace grinned through bloody teeth. "Yeah," he muttered. "I guess we are." Frank didn't wait. He moved fast, grabbing Shadow's leash, helping the battered dog to his feet. Shadow leaned against him but stayed standing. The other bikers didn't move. They just watched, some smirking, some silent. Daniel grabbed his gun from the floor, tucking it into his holster. "If I see you near my house again," he said, voice low, "I won't be this generous." Mace wiped his mouth. "Noted." Frank didn't trust it, but they were outnumbered, and they had what they came for. They turned, walked away. And not a single Iron Fang stopped them, but Frank knew better. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The ride back to Daniel's house was tense, filled with the low rumble of the truck's engine and the steady, ragged breathing of Shadow in the back seat. The dog was hurt, but he was still holding himself upright, refusing to show weakness. Frank kept glancing at him through the rearview mirror, noting the way his muscles trembled with exhaustion. The kid had fought hard, harder than most men would have, and he hadn't broken. That kind of spirit was rare. It was the kind that got men killed in war zones, and the kind that made legends when they survived. Daniel sat in the passenger seat, his knuckles bloodied and his ribs already darkening with bruises. He hadn't spoken since they left the warehouse. Frank didn't push. He knew the look of a man who wasn't done being angry. The fight had been over the moment Mace hit the ground, but something in Daniel's eyes said he wasn't satisfied, and Frank understood why. This wasn't just about Shadow. It wasn't just about a stolen dog or a bruised ego. It was about the way those bikers had looked at him, the way they had acted like they could take anything and get away with it. They had let them walk out tonight, but that had been a decision, not a surrender. And men like Mace never took a loss lightly. Frank pulled into the driveway, killing the engine. "Get him inside," he said gruffly. "I'll grab the first aid kit." Daniel nodded, slipping out and moving to the back. Shadow's ears perked slightly, and despite his injuries, he made an effort to step down from the truck on his own. Daniel stayed close, keeping a hand near his side, but letting him move at his own pace. Even now, the dog wanted to prove he was still strong. Frank grabbed the kit from under the seat and followed them inside, shutting the door behind him. The house was dark, quiet, too quiet. He locked the door out of habit, though he knew a lock wouldn't stop what was coming. He had been around long enough to know when a fight wasn't over. Shadow eased himself onto the floor near the couch, his breathing slow and steady. Daniel crouched beside him, his fingers tracing lightly over the bruises and cuts along the dog's ribs. His jaw clenched. "They beat him," he murmured. Frank set the kit on the table, watching the younger man. "Yeah," he said simply. "But they didn't break him." Daniel exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "Not yet." Frank opened the kit, pulling out antiseptic and bandages. "They will be back," he said after a moment, his voice even. "You know that, right?" Daniel didn't look up. "I'm counting on it." Frank studied him, seeing past the anger to the thing underneath. This wasn't just about revenge. This was a man who had spent too long holding back, who had spent years playing by the rules while men like Mace laughed in the face of them. He had tried to be the better man, and now he was realizing that wasn't enough. Frank knelt beside Shadow, carefully cleaning one of the deeper cuts along his side. The dog barely flinched, his eyes steady. He had the same look Daniel did, calm but not at peace. "You thinking about hitting them first?" Frank asked casually. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Not unless I have to." Frank nodded. That was the right answer, but not the one that would keep him safe. "You can't go at this alone," he said. Daniel finally looked up, his eyes sharp. "You offering?" Frank smirked. "Kid, if I wasn't, I wouldn't still be here." Daniel exhaled, the smallest flicker of gratitude crossing his face before it hardened again. "I don't know how far they'll go." Frank set the bloodied cloth aside. "Far," he said simply. "Men like them don't let things go. They're gonna test you, see if you're willing to stand your ground. If you back down, they own you. If you fight back, they'll come harder." He met Daniel's gaze. "And if you take one of them out of the picture, then it's a war." Daniel leaned back against the couch, nodding slowly. He already knew. He had known the moment he stepped into that warehouse that this wasn't something that would end cleanly. But there was no hesitation in his eyes. He had made his decision. A low growl rumbled from Shadow's throat, and both men turned toward the window. Daniel stood, his body tense. "What is it?" Frank reached for his rifle, his gut already telling him what he didn't want to say out loud. Shadow limped toward the door, his nose flaring, his ears twitching toward the front yard. Then came the sound. Engines, the deep, guttural roar of motorcycles rolling slow, circling like wolves in the dark. Frank moved to the window, peering through the blinds. 5 bikes, maybe 6, crawling down the street at an idle pace. They weren't in a hurry. They wanted to be seen. Daniel cursed under his breath. "They're testing me," Frank nodded. "Seeing if you scare easy." The bikes didn't stop. They just circled, slow and steady, the glow of headlights washing over the house in rhythmic flashes. Then one of them revved his engine, loud, deliberate, a warning. Then another and another. The sound built into a wall of noise, vibrating through the walls. A message written in gasoline and steel. They didn't have to say the words. Daniel knew what it meant. This wasn't over. The roar cut off as suddenly as it had begun. One by one the bikers peeled away, disappearing into the night. The street was silent again, but the damage was done. Frank let the curtain fall back into place. "They're waiting for you to slip." Daniel didn't move, his fists flexing at his sides. "Then they'll be waiting a long time." Frank studied him, then glanced at Shadow. The dog was still staring at the door, still growling low and deep, his body stiff despite his injuries. "We need to get ahead of this," Frank muttered. Daniel's eyes flicked toward him. "What are you thinking?" Frank sat down at the table, grabbing a bottle of whiskey and pouring 2 glasses. He slid one toward Daniel, who hesitated before taking it. "I'm thinking," Frank said, taking a slow sip, "that we stop waiting for them to make the next move." Daniel's fingers tightened around the glass. "We make it first." The night stretched long after the bikers left, but neither Daniel nor Frank spoke much. The silence between them was filled with unspoken truths, both men knowing that what had started was not something that could be undone. The Iron Fangs had drawn their line in the sand, daring Daniel to step over it. If he hesitated now, if he let them dictate what happened next, he'd spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. They would never stop, never let him breathe, not until they owned him or destroyed him. Daniel had made his choice. Frank saw it in the way the younger man sat at the table, his jaw locked, his knuckles tight around the glass he hadn't touched. He didn't need to say it out loud. Frank knew. He had been here before, in another life, another war, where men decided in quiet moments whether they would live as prey or fight as wolves. Shadow lay near the couch, his body still sore from the beating he had taken. But his head was up, his eyes tracking every shift in the room. He knew too. Dogs always knew. Frank exhaled slowly and leaned back in his chair. "What's the move, then?" Daniel finally looked up, his eyes dark. "We hit them first." Frank grinned, the kind of grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Good answer." They sat there, mapping out possibilities in their minds, knowing there weren't many. The Iron Fangs weren't some gang of amateurs. They were organized, dangerous, and they thrived on fear. If Daniel and Frank wanted a shot at shutting them down, they needed to do it fast and decisive before the gang had time to regroup. Frank tapped a finger against the table. "I've been watching these bastards for a while. They've got a few spots around town. But the real nest? That's the bar off the highway. Runs all night. Deals happen in the back." Daniel nodded. "Mace will be there." "Damn right he will," Frank muttered. "He wants to see what you'll do next. You walk in there, you better be ready to finish it." Daniel exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "We can't just walk in and start shooting." Frank smirked. "No, but we can make them wish we had." Before Daniel could ask what that meant, Shadow's ears twitched, his body suddenly going rigid. Then came the sound, a long, painful howl, splitting through the quiet like a blade. Daniel shot up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. He knew that sound. Shadow knew it too. It was another dog. It wasn't just a cry. It was raw, filled with something deeper, something desperate. Frank's expression hardened. "They've got another one." Daniel was already moving, grabbing his gun from the counter, slipping it into his holster as he headed for the door. "Where?" Frank followed, grabbing his rifle. "Not far. Probably the same warehouse." Daniel's gut burned with fury as he stepped onto the porch, scanning the darkness. It wasn't enough for the Iron Fangs to steal Shadow, to try to break him. Now they had another dog, another victim. And they wanted Daniel to hear it. They wanted him to know. That howl hadn't been an accident. It was a message. Frank climbed into the truck, firing the engine to life. Daniel barely got the door shut before they were moving, tires kicking up dust as they tore out of the driveway. No more waiting. This time they were taking the fight to them. The roads blurred under the headlights as they sped toward the industrial district, neither of them speaking, their focus locked on what was coming. The warehouse loomed ahead, just as it had before, the old steel beams catching the moonlight. Frank slowed the truck, parking a block away. No need to announce their arrival. They stepped out, moving quickly along the shadows, keeping low. The howl came again, closer this time. Frank led the way around the back of the building. Stopping at a rusted-out section of fencing, he crouched, scanning the area. "Looks clear," Daniel nodded. They moved in, slipping through the fence, their boots barely making a sound against the cracked pavement. Then they heard voices, laughter, low, cruel, the kind that made Daniel's blood boil. They crept forward, pressing against the warehouse wall, peering through a broken window. Inside, 4 bikers stood around a cage, the kind used for shipping freight. And inside that cage, a dog lay curled up, ribs showing through its fur, its body trembling. A mutt, smaller than Shadow, but built of the same stock. A fighter, one of the bikers, a wiry guy with a missing tooth, nudged the cage with his boot. "Ain't got the same fight in him as the last one." Another man chuckled. "Not yet." Daniel felt his breath come sharp, controlled, his fingers itching to wrap around his gun. Frank leaned in close, whispering, "We take 'em now, it's loud." Daniel didn't care, but he forced himself to nod. Frank motioned for him to move left while he took right. They slipped along the walls, inching toward the entrance. Inside, the wiry biker pulled a bottle from his pocket, shaking it. The dog inside the cage flinched. The biker grinned. "Time to see how you like fire." Daniel stepped through the doorway. "Drop it." The words cut through the air like a bullet. The bikers froze. Daniel's gun was up, aimed at the man with the bottle. His finger hovered over the trigger. Frank stepped in behind him, rifle leveled. "You boys are real pieces of shit." The wiry man hesitated, his eyes darting between them. Hey, he started, hands raising slightly. "No need to." Daniel didn't wait. He moved fast, his fist cracking against the man's jaw. The biker hit the floor, the bottle shattering beside him. The other three moved, reaching for weapons, but Frank was faster. The rifle barked, the bullet hitting just inches from their feet. "Try it," Frank warned. They didn't. Daniel grabbed the keys from the wiry man's pocket, his hands steady as he unlocked the cage. The dog didn't move at first, too scared, too weak. Daniel knelt. "It's okay, buddy." Slowly, cautiously, the dog stepped out. Then, without hesitation, he pressed his head against Daniel's chest. Daniel exhaled, his throat tightening. Frank nudged him. "We need to move." Daniel stood, his grip firm on the dog's collar. "You tell Mace," he said, his voice low, deadly, "that this ends tonight." The bikers didn't respond. They didn't need to. Daniel and Frank slipped into the night, the dog following close behind. The Iron Fangs had made a mistake. They had pushed too far, and now they were about to learn what it meant to go to war. The air was thick with the weight of what was coming. The drive back was quiet, not the kind of quiet that came from exhaustion, but the kind that settled deep in a man's bones when he knew there was no turning back. Frank had seen it before, in men about to walk into battle, in soldiers who had decided they weren't coming home unless the fight was finished. Daniel had that same look now, the dog curled up in the back seat, still trembling but no longer caged, no longer waiting for the next hit, the next cruelty. He didn't have a name. He had probably never had one, but he had been saved tonight. That was enough. Frank parked outside Daniel's house and shut off the engine, glancing toward the street before stepping out. It was quiet, too quiet. No sign of the bikers, but that didn't mean they weren't watching. Frank knew how these men operated. They had given Daniel a warning with Shadow, tested him by taking another dog. Now, Daniel had responded. He had crossed the line they had drawn, and that meant one thing: they would be coming. Daniel led the dog inside, his movements slow, controlled, the energy in his body coiled so tightly that Frank was almost surprised the younger man hadn't snapped already. Shadow lifted his head from his spot by the couch, sniffed the air, and let out a low, approving huff before resting again. The two dogs exchanged a glance, something unspoken passing between them. They understood each other. Survivors always did. Frank shut the door behind them and locked it. "You know what this means, right?" Daniel didn't turn as he pulled a bottle of whiskey from the counter and poured himself a glass. "Yeah." Frank watched him take a slow sip, his knuckles still bruised from the fight. "They're gonna come hard." Daniel exhaled through his nose. "Let them." Frank smirked, shaking his head. "You sound like me 40 years ago. Didn't end well for a lot of people." Daniel's grip tightened on the glass. "I'm not letting them control my life. I'm not running." Frank leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "Then we need to hit them before they hit you." Daniel looked up at him then, something flickering behind his eyes. "You got a plan?" Frank chuckled. "Kid, I always got a plan." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded map, spreading it over the kitchen table. "They got their main clubhouse here, just off the highway. That's where Mace and his boys run things. But they got another place, an auto shop. They use it for laundering, for storage, for whatever the hell else they don't want people sniffing around." He tapped a calloused finger on the paper. "That's our target." Daniel studied the map. "You think they'll be there tonight?" Frank nodded. "If I were Mace, I'd have my guys regroup, get my next move lined up. He doesn't think you'll strike first." A slow grin spread across his face. "So we do." Daniel exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "What's the play?" Frank's grin widened. "We go in quiet. We take out their security, send a message, make sure they know this isn't just some cop looking to uphold the law. This is personal. Daniel nodded, the fire in his chest burning hotter. Then let's move. Frank grunted in approval, grabbing his rifle. Hope you remember how to stay quiet. Kid, Daniel smirked, holstering his gun. I learned from the best. They moved under the cover of darkness, two shadows slipping through the back alleys and side streets of Brookhaven. The auto shop wasn't far, tucked away in the industrial district where no one would hear gunshots, where the Iron Fangs could operate without worrying about curious eyes. Frank and Daniel kept low, cutting across an overgrown lot before stopping near a row of abandoned trailers. The auto shop sat just ahead, its garage doors shut, the dim glow of a light visible through the office window. A single motorcycle was parked outside, and a black SUV sat further down in the lot. Frank scanned the perimeter, two guards, one smoking near the side door, the other pacing near the back. Daniel crouched beside him. We take them out quiet. Frank grinned. I was hoping you'd say that. Daniel moved first, slipping through the darkness like a predator, his footsteps silent. He crept up behind the first man, his breath steady, his heart slow. The biker flicked his cigarette away, exhaling into the night. He never heard Daniel move. A quick, brutal strike to the throat. The man choked, his hands flying up in shock. Daniel caught him before he could make a sound, twisting his head sharply. A sickening snap, and the body went limp. Frank watched from the shadows, nodding in approval. Not bad. Daniel shot him a look before moving toward the back. The second guard was still pacing, muttering something into his phone. Daniel waited, his body coiled, his breath even. The moment the biker turned his back, Daniel lunged, wrapping an arm around his throat and yanking him backward. The man struggled, but Daniel tightened his grip, dragging him into the shadows. 30 seconds later, the body slumped to the ground. Frank clapped him on the back. Now you're thinking like a soldier. Daniel ignored him, his focus locked on the building. Let's go. They slipped inside through the side door, moving like ghosts. The air was thick with the scent of oil and metal, the faint hum of classic rock playing from an old radio. The main floor was empty, but voices drifted from an office near the back. Daniel motioned for Frank to take the left while he moved right. They reached the door, listening. Mace wants us to wait, one man was saying. Says we let Briggs sweat a little. Another voice scoffed. Bullshit. We should have put a bullet in his head when we had the chance. Frank grinned. Let's introduce ourselves. Daniel kicked the door open. The two men inside barely had time to react before Daniel was on them. The first man reached for his gun, but Frank put a bullet through his shoulder before he could pull the trigger. The second lunged, swinging a crowbar, but Daniel caught his wrist, twisting it hard until bones cracked. The biker screamed, dropping to his knees. Frank shut the door behind them, stepping over the bleeding man. Well, boys, looks like your night just took a turn. Daniel knelt in front of the man, clutching his wrist. Tell Mace this doesn't end until he's out of my town. The biker spat blood onto the floor. Go to hell. Daniel grabbed him by the collar, dragging him close. You first. Frank chuckled, patting Daniel on the shoulder. That's the spirit. They left the men broken but breathing. The message was clear. This wasn't a fight anymore. This was war. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the map Frank had spread out between them. His knuckles still stained with the blood of the men they'd left broken at the auto shop. The house was quiet, but the silence didn't bring peace. It felt like the calm before a storm, the kind of stillness that only came before something violent. Shadow lay nearby, his breathing steady but his body tense, ears twitching at the slightest noise. The other dog, the one they had rescued, was curled up in the corner, resting but still watching. Two survivors, waiting for what came next. Frank poured himself another drink, the amber liquid catching the dim light of the kitchen. He didn't offer Daniel one. He knew the younger man's mind was too sharp, too focused, running 100 different ways this could end. They'll be moving soon, Frank muttered, leaning back in his chair. Mace isn't the type to take a hit and do nothing. He'll come back hard. Daniel exhaled, running a hand over his face. "Let him." Frank smirked, shaking his head. "You sound like me when I was your age. Ready to take on the world, not giving a damn about the consequences." He took a slow sip, eyes locking onto Daniel's. "But there's always consequences." Daniel's jaw tightened. "What would you do?" Frank studied him for a long moment, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I'd end it before it gets worse." He tapped the map with one calloused finger. "We hit them where it hurts. Fast, hard, no second chances." Daniel nodded slowly. "We take out their headquarters." Frank's smirk widened. "Now you're thinking like a soldier." The plan formed quickly. The Iron Fangs' main clubhouse was just off the highway, a dive bar that doubled as their command center. They stored weapons there, ran their drug operations from the back rooms, and gathered there to plan whatever illegal shit they were involved in. It was their home base, the one place they thought they were untouchable, until tonight. Frank checked his rifle as Daniel went over the details one last time. The goal wasn't to wipe them all out. This wasn't a suicide mission, but to make sure Mace and his men understood that this fight wasn't worth it. Daniel didn't want to drag this out. He wanted it done. Frank glanced at him as they geared up. "You sure you're ready for this?" Daniel holstered his gun and met Frank's gaze. "I don't have a choice." They loaded up in Frank's truck, moving in silence as they drove toward the outskirts of town. The roads were empty, the sky a deep, endless black. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. Daniel tightened his grip on his gun. He wasn't going to let Mace come for him again. He was going to finish this. The clubhouse was exactly as Frank had described it, an old run-down bar with a neon sign flickering weakly above the entrance. A half-dozen bikes were parked outside, their chrome catching the moonlight. Two men stood at the door, smoking and laughing, completely unaware of what was coming. Daniel and Frank parked a block away, cutting the engine. They moved on foot, keeping low, their footsteps silent on the cracked pavement. Frank's voice was barely above a whisper. "We go in quiet, take out the lookouts, then move inside. Quick and clean." Daniel nodded, his grip tightening on his gun. They crept forward, staying in the shadows. Frank took the man on the left, Daniel took the one on the right. A sharp chokehold, a muffled gasp, and then silence. The bodies slumped to the ground. Frank wiped his hands on his jeans. "Still got it." Daniel barely acknowledged him. His focus was on the door, on what was waiting inside. Frank nudged him. No hesitation. Daniel exhaled sharply. "I know." They moved inside. The bar was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of alcohol, sweat, and cigarette smoke. A few men sat at the counter, bottles in their hands, talking low. Others were gathered at the pool table, laughing over some inside joke. And at the center of it all was Mace. He sat in the corner booth, legs spread, a cigarette dangling from his lips. His knuckles were still bruised from the fight with Daniel. His expression was calm, too calm, as if he had been waiting for this. Frank muttered under his breath. "Shit!" The doors slammed shut behind them. Daniel didn't flinch. He had already expected the trap. Mace exhaled a cloud of smoke, flicking his cigarette into an ashtray. "Took you long enough." Frank kept his rifle steady, eyes scanning the room. There were more of them than they had planned for, maybe 10, maybe more. Daniel's voice was ice. "Let's end this." Mace grinned. "That's the plan." And then all hell broke loose. The first shot came from the bar. Daniel barely had time to duck as the bullet shattered the bottle behind him. Frank moved fast, taking cover behind a table, returning fire with sharp, calculated shots. Daniel rolled to the side, taking aim and squeezing the trigger. The man at the bar went down, clutching his leg with a scream. Chaos erupted. Mace was gone, slipping out the back as his men fought to cover his escape. Daniel cursed, shoving forward, using the distraction to move toward the hallway. Frank covered him, his rifle barking in short bursts, forcing the remaining bikers into cover. Daniel sprinted down the hall, kicking open the back door. Just in time to see Mace climbing onto his bike. For a second, their eyes met. Then Mace smirked and peeled off into the night. Daniel didn't think. He just ran. His legs burned, his breath came in ragged gasps, but he didn't stop. He vaulted over a low fence, cutting across the lot, trying to close the distance. But Mace was already too far. The roar of the motorcycle faded into the night. Daniel skidded to a stop, his fists clenching. Frank jogged up behind him, breathing hard. "He's gone!" Daniel exhaled sharply, rage burning in his chest. Not for long. They turned back to the clubhouse. The fight was over. The remaining bikers had either fled or were too injured to put up a fight. The building was wrecked, bullet holes in the walls, shattered glass on the floor. Frank sighed. "Well, we sure as hell sent a message." Daniel's jaw tightened. Not enough. Frank studied him, then clapped a hand on his shoulder. "We'll find him." Daniel barely nodded. He wasn't thinking about Mace anymore. He was thinking about what came next, because if Mace wanted a war, Daniel was ready to give him one. The air inside the wrecked clubhouse was thick with gunpowder and spilled liquor, the scent of blood cutting through it like a knife. Daniel stood in the wreckage, his heart still hammering from the fight, his fingers flexing around the grip of his gun. Mace was gone, but that didn't matter. Not yet. The real war had just started. Frank stepped over a broken chair, his rifle still slung over his shoulder. His sharp eyes scanned the scene, taking in the bodies. Some groaning, some unconscious, some too still to move again. The Iron Fangs weren't dead, not as a gang, but they were wounded, and wounded men always came back harder. "We need to move," Frank said, voice low, calculated. "Cops will be crawling this place soon, and we ain't got the luxury of explaining ourselves." Daniel exhaled sharply, rolling his shoulders. His ribs ached from the fight, his bruises screaming at him, but the pain barely registered. "We didn't finish it," Frank grunted. "We didn't need to. We set the goddamn fire. Now we see what burns." Daniel shook his head. "Mace isn't going to let this go." Frank smirked. Didn't expect him to. He nudged one of the downed bikers with the toe of his boot, a man groaning, clutching his stomach where a bullet had grazed him. "But right now he's on the run, licking his wounds. That buys us time." Daniel wasn't convinced. Time didn't mean anything when the enemy had nothing to lose. The Iron Fangs had been challenged, and men like Mace only knew one way to answer: with blood. Frank was already moving, heading for the exit. "Come on, kid, we got work to do." Daniel followed, stepping over shattered glass and spent shells as they slipped into the night. The truck was parked 2 blocks away, hidden near an old loading dock. They moved fast, their shadows blending into the empty streets. The town eerily silent after the storm they had just unleashed. Frank climbed into the driver's seat, starting the engine without hesitation. "We go to ground for a while. Let the dust settle." Daniel's jaw clenched, and then Frank shot him a sidelong glance. "Then we end it." The drive back was tense, both men lost in their own thoughts. Shadow was waiting at the house, ears perked as Daniel stepped inside. The other dog, the one they had rescued, lifted his head slightly from his spot on the floor. He was still adjusting, still waiting to see if this place was real, if safety was something he could trust. Daniel crouched beside him, running a hand over his fur. "We're gonna need a name for you," he murmured. Frank leaned against the wall, watching. "Dog's been through hell, need something that fits." Daniel thought for a moment, then softly, "Ghost." The dog's ears flicked, his tail moved slightly. Frank nodded. "Yeah, that'll do." The night dragged on. Neither of them slept, and just before dawn, the war came knocking. A single gunshot cracked through the stillness, shattering the quiet like glass. Daniel was up before the echo faded, gun in hand, moving toward the door. Frank was already there, his rifle steady, his eyes sharp. Shadow was growling low, his body coiled. Ghost stood beside him, silent but alert. Another shot, closer this time, then the sound of engines. Daniel pulled the curtain back just enough to see them. Motorcycles, at least 10, maybe more, crawling down the street like a pack of wolves. The Iron Fangs weren't hiding anymore. They weren't circling like they had the first time. They were coming. Frank exhaled. "Told you they'd come hard." Daniel didn't respond. He was already moving, already grabbing spare magazines, already locking down in his mind what needed to be done. He had spent years enforcing the law, living by its rules, but those rules didn't mean shit right now. Right now, the only law that mattered was survival. Frank was calm. Too calm. The way a man got when he had been through this too many times before. "We got options." Daniel checked his gun, chambering around. "We hold our ground," Frank smirked. "That's what I was hoping you'd say." The first shot hit the house, shattering a window. Shadow barked, Ghost let out a low growl, and then it was all movement. Daniel and Frank shifted fast, years of instinct taking over. The Iron Fangs weren't kicking down the door yet, weren't storming in full force. They were testing, seeing if the fight would come to them. Daniel pressed against the wall, peering through the gap. The bikes were still running, headlights throwing sharp beams through the early morning fog. A few men were already moving on foot, spreading out, trying to get angles. Frank clicked the safety off his rifle. "They don't know we're ready." Daniel exhaled. "Let's show them." The next shot wasn't theirs, it was Frank's. The rifle barked, and one of the bikers dropped, clutching his leg. The others scattered, diving behind whatever cover they could find. Daniel moved fast, stepping out just long enough to fire 2 quick shots, forcing them back further. The bikers weren't expecting resistance like this. They had thought they were coming to finish something, not walking into a fight they weren't prepared for. Frank chuckled, reloading. "They'll rethink their strategy real quick." Daniel wasn't so sure. Mace hadn't shown himself yet, and that meant he had a plan. Then, as if summoned by the thought, another sound cut through the chaos. A roar. Not an engine. A truck. Daniel barely had time to process before the old black pickup came barreling around the corner, its tires screeching against the pavement. Frank cursed. "Move!" Daniel grabbed Shadow's collar, pulling him back just as the truck smashed through the fence, wood splintering, metal groaning as it skidded to a stop. The driver's side door flew open. Mace stepped out. His face was bruised, his knuckles still raw from their last fight, but he was smiling. "Morning, Briggs," he called. "Figured we'd settle this proper." Daniel stepped forward, a gun at his side. "You don't get to settle shit." Mace spread his arms. "You sure about that?" The truck's doors opened. More bikers climbed out, more than Daniel had expected, more than he had prepared for. And suddenly, it wasn't just a fight anymore. It was a goddamn war, Frank muttered under his breath. "This might get messy." Daniel didn't look away from Mace. "It already is." The bikers moved in. The dogs growled. And then, the real fight began. The moment stretched, tension crackling in the early morning air like a live wire. The Iron Fangs stood spread out across the yard, their weapons low but ready. Mace leaned casually against the truck he had just rammed through Daniel's fence, his smirk wide, lazy, as if he had already won. Frank kept his rifle steady at his side, his sharp eyes scanning the gang's formation. He counted at least a dozen, maybe more, some armed, some looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. That was good. Weak links snapped first. Daniel took a slow step forward, Shadow and Ghost at his sides. The dogs were silent, their bodies tense, waiting for the signal. Daniel's gun was firm in his grip, but he didn't raise it. Not yet. Mace exhaled smoke from the cigarette hanging off his lips and tilted his head. "You look tired, Briggs." Daniel didn't respond. He just stared, his body still, his heartbeat steady. Mace spread his arms wide, taking in the damage around them. "This wasn't how I saw things going. You were supposed to roll over, take your hit like a good little cop. But instead, you dragged an old man into this and tore up my place." He clicked his tongue. "That was a mistake." Frank chuckled low. "Ain't the first one you've made, boy." The amusement flickered in Mace's expression for half a second before his jaw clenched. He didn't like being challenged by someone who had seen more fights than he ever would. One of the bikers shifted, a wiry guy with a scar running down his jaw. His fingers twitched near his waistband, and Frank noticed. Daniel did too. "Tell your guy not to be stupid," Daniel said, voice even. "First man who moves dies." Mace studied him, then laughed. "Jesus, Briggs, you're not even pretending anymore, are you? Not even trying to be the good guy." Daniel didn't blink. "I was the good guy. You made sure that didn't last." Mace smirked as if he liked that answer. "All right then, since we're past the point of pretending, let's be honest. He kicked off the truck, taking a step forward, his eyes locking onto Daniel's like he was trying to pry into his skull. "You can't win this," Frank grunted. "That's so." Mace ignored him. "You don't get it, do you, Briggs? You think you can take us all down with that badge and that dog? You think people like you get to walk away from a fight like this?" He shook his head. "Nah, doesn't work that way. You put your nose where it doesn't belong. You embarrassed me. And now I've got to make sure people see what happens when you push the wrong people." Daniel's grip on his gun tightened. "Then do it." The smirk flickered. Just for a second. Mace was many things, but reckless wasn't one of them. He wanted Daniel to back down, to walk away, to accept that this fight belonged to the Iron Fangs. But Daniel hadn't walked away before. He sure as hell wasn't going to start now. Mace sighed, rubbing his jaw like he was bored. "Look, I get it. You're pissed. We took your dog, roughed him up. You wanted payback. You got it." He gestured to the wreckage around them. "Now I'm giving you a choice," Frank muttered. "Here it comes." Mace ignored him. "You can pack your shit and leave town. You disappear, this all goes away. You stay, and I promise you, it only gets worse." Daniel's eyes flicked over the gang, then back to Mace. "That's your deal?" Mace shrugged. "It's more than you deserve." Daniel nodded slowly. Then, before anyone could react, he raised his gun and fired. The bullet hit the ground at Mace's feet, kicking up dirt. The bikers jolted, hands flying to their weapons. But no one fired. Daniel's voice was calm. "You don't get to make threats in my house." Silence. Frank smirked, his grip tightening on his rifle. "Oh, I like him." Mace's lips curled, his fingers flexing at his sides. But he didn't move. Daniel tilted his head. "That was your warning shot." For the first time since arriving, Mace looked genuinely unsure. He had expected resistance, sure, but he had expected hesitation too, fear. Cops had rules. Cops played it safe. Daniel wasn't playing anything. Mace studied him, then, slowly, he smirked again. It wasn't real this time. "All right, Briggs, I see how it is." He exhaled, flicking his cigarette onto the ground. "Have it your way." He whistled once, a sharp, high-pitched sound. The bikers backed off, stepping away, moving toward their bikes and the truck. Mace turned, climbing into the driver's seat. Before closing the door, he glanced back at Daniel. "This doesn't end with me leaving." Daniel nodded, didn't think it would. The truck's engine roared to life. The bikers mounted up one by one, engines growling like animals waiting for release. Mace pulled away first. The others followed, roaring down the street, their headlights cutting through the fog. Then, just like that, they were gone. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. Frank let out a breath, rolling his shoulders. "Well, that was fun." Daniel turned, walking back toward the house. Shadow and Ghost were still waiting near the doorway, ears perked, watching everything. Frank followed him inside, locking the door behind them. "He'll be back." Daniel nodded, setting his gun on the table. "I know." Frank scratched his chin. "You really ready for that?" Daniel exhaled, his fingers brushing over Shadow's fur, grounding himself. "I'm done waiting." Frank smirked. "Now you're talking my language." Outside, the sun was starting to rise, painting the sky in pale shades of pink and gray. The house was still standing. The fight hadn't come tonight, but it would. And next time, Daniel wouldn't be waiting for it. He would be bringing it to them. The air inside the house was thick with the weight of what had just happened. Daniel sat at the table, his hands pressed against the wood, his jaw tight. The Iron Fangs had made their move, and instead of breaking him, they had set something loose inside him. The fear, the hesitation, the rules that had once held him back, they were gone now, burned away by the simple truth that there was no law here, no authority that would come to his rescue. This wasn't about justice anymore. This was war. Frank stood by the window. Frank stood, his rifle resting against his shoulder as he watched the empty street. His body was still, but Daniel knew his mind was working, calculating. Frank had seen more wars than he could count, had fought in them, had survived them. But even he knew that this wasn't the kind of fight that ended with a handshake and a lesson learned. The Iron Fangs had been wounded, and men like Mace didn't take humiliation lightly. "You know what's coming next, don't you?" Frank finally said. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. Yeah. Frank turned, his expression unreadable. Then what's the play? Daniel looked up, meeting the older man's gaze. We don't wait for them. Frank smirked, nodding approvingly. Now you're thinking straight. Daniel pushed back from the table and stood. His body ached from the fight, from the tension coiled in his muscles, but he didn't care. He moved to the closet, pulling it open. Inside, his old duffel bag sat buried beneath years of uniforms, gear, and reminders of a past life. He dragged it out and unzipped it, revealing a collection of weapons, body armor, and equipment that had been stored away for a moment just like this. Frank let out a low whistle. Didn't take you for a man who kept souvenirs. Daniel pulled out a tactical vest and strapped it on. Didn't think I'd need them again. Frank picked up a pistol from the bag, checking the weight. Looks like you were wrong. Daniel holstered his own weapon, double-checking his ammo. He had spent years playing by the book, believing that the badge meant something, that the law would hold men like Mace accountable. That belief had been stripped away piece by piece until all that was left was this, a fight that could only end one way. Frank tossed him a magazine. So where do we hit 'em? Daniel caught it without looking. The bar was just a warning shot. They've got another place, an old scrapyard outside of town. Frank arched a brow. What's there? Daniel tightened the straps on his vest. Guns, drugs, everything they don't want found. Frank's grin widened. Well, damn. Now that's a target. Daniel turned to Shadow, who sat watching him with those intelligent, knowing eyes. The dog had been through hell, had survived it, and still stood ready for whatever came next. Ghost, the dog they had rescued, lay curled nearby, still recovering, still learning that he was safe now. Daniel knelt, scratching Shadow behind the ears. Not this time, boy. Shadow let out a low huff, as if he understood but didn't agree. Frank grabbed his rifle and slung it over his shoulder. We move now? Daniel nodded. Before they realize what's coming, they loaded up in Frank's truck, the engine rumbling low as they pulled onto the empty road. The sky had darkened again, the early morning light swallowed by thick clouds rolling in from the west. It felt right, the kind of night that promised violence, the kind that made men wonder if they would see the sunrise. Frank drove fast but steady, his hands relaxed on the wheel. You ever think about what comes after this? Daniel stared out at the road ahead. After? Frank chuckled. Yeah. You think about what happens if you make it through this? If you put Mace in the ground? Daniel's grip on his gun tightened. Not really. Frank nodded, as if he expected that answer. That's the thing about war. It's hard to think past it. Daniel didn't respond. They reached the outskirts of town within minutes, the lights of Brookhaven fading behind them. The scrapyard loomed in the distance, a sprawling mess of rusted metal and forgotten wreckage. It was the kind of place that swallowed men whole, where no one asked questions about the noises in the night. Frank pulled off the road, cutting the engine. They sat in the silence for a moment, listening. Daniel scanned the yard. The Iron Fangs were here. He could see the dim glow of cigarette embers, the faint murmur of voices. A truck was parked near one of the old shipping containers, its headlights off. The place wasn't heavily guarded, not like the clubhouse had been. They're not expecting us, Daniel muttered. Frank grinned. Even better. They moved in low, keeping to the shadows. Daniel led, his body tense but controlled, his movements silent. Frank followed, his rifle ready, his steps just as careful. They reached the outer fence, slipping through a gap in the chain link. Two men stood near the truck, their backs to them. Frank whispered, I'll take left. Daniel nodded. They moved as one. Daniel was fast, wrapping his arm around the first man's throat and dragging him back into the dark. The biker struggled, but Daniel tightened his grip, cutting off the air. Seconds later, the man went limp. Frank took his target down just as efficiently, his knife flashing once in the dim light before the body slumped to the ground. Daniel pulled out his gun, scanning the yard. The entrance to one of the storage containers was open, faint light spilling out. Voices came from inside. Frank nudged him. They're sitting ducks. Daniel exhaled. Let's finish this. They moved in, quick and silent. The first man in the doorway barely had time to react before Daniel's gun cracked, dropping him where he stood. The others turned, confusion flashing across their faces before Frank's rifle barked twice, sending them scrambling for cover. Daniel didn't stop. He pushed forward, his gun steady, taking down another biker before he could raise his weapon. The last man tried to run. Daniel caught him before he made it 5 steps. He slammed the man against the container wall, his forearm pressing hard against his throat. "Where's Mace?" The biker gasped, his hands clawing at Daniel's arm. I don't know. He left after the clubhouse." Daniel's grip tightened. "Where is he headed?" The man choked out. "Old highway, safe house. That's all I know, I swear." Daniel held him there for a moment longer, then let go. The biker collapsed, coughing, his face pale with fear. Frank stepped over the bodies. "Well, that was easy." Daniel turned, his eyes cold. "It's not over yet," Frank nodded. "Then let's go finish it." The Iron Fangs had made a mistake. They had underestimated the man they were hunting. And now Daniel was going to make sure Mace never got another chance. The truck tore down the old highway, tires eating up the cracked pavement as Daniel and Frank moved toward the inevitable. The air inside the cab was thick with silence, both men locked into the moment, the knowledge that there was no coming back from what they were about to do. Mace had made it clear this wasn't a fight that would end with a handshake or a warning. This was a war, and Daniel was done letting the enemy dictate the rules. Frank kept his eyes on the road, his fingers relaxed on the wheel. But Daniel could see the tension in his jaw, the way his breath came a little slower, more measured. He had seen this before, men gearing up for something that might be their last fight. But Frank wasn't afraid. He was the kind of man who had already made peace with whatever ending waited for him. Daniel wasn't sure if he had. "You got a plan, kid?" Frank asked, his voice steady. Daniel's fingers flexed against his gun. "Go in fast, take out the guards, end it before they know what's happening." Frank nodded approvingly. "Straightforward. I like it." He glanced over, smirking. "You always this direct?" Daniel didn't answer. He had spent years playing by the book, following procedures, trusting that justice would always come if you did the right thing. That was gone now, burned away the moment Shadow had been taken, the moment he had realized that the law wasn't enough to stop men like Mace. Justice had rules, revenge didn't. They reached the turnoff, an unmarked road leading deep into the woods. The Iron Fangs safe house wasn't in town. It was buried out here where no one would hear the gunshots. A place they used when they needed to disappear, when they needed to make sure their enemies never got back up. Tonight, it would be their tomb. Frank slowed the truck, pulling off the road, killing the lights. They sat for a moment, watching the distant glow of headlights filtering through the trees, the faint outline of a cabin just visible in the darkness. 3 vehicles, Frank murmured, counting. At least 10 men, maybe more inside. Daniel checked his ammo. "Doesn't matter," Frank chuckled. "That's what I like about you." They moved fast, slipping from the truck, keeping low as they approached the cabin. The night was thick, the scent of damp earth heavy in the air. Shadow and Ghost had been left behind. This wasn't their fight. 2 guards stood outside the front door, smoking, their voices low. Frank glanced at Daniel. "You want left or right?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "Right," Frank nodded. "On 3. They moved as one, slipping through the dark. The first man barely had time to react before Frank's knife slid between his ribs, the breath leaving his lungs in a silent gasp. Daniel hit his target hard, a sharp strike to the throat cutting off the man's yell before his gun came up, silencing him for good. The bodies slumped to the ground. Frank wiped his blade on his pants. "They'll notice soon." Daniel was already moving. The front door was locked, but that wasn't a problem. A sharp kick sent it flying open, the wood splintering as it slammed inward. Chaos erupted. The first biker inside turned, startled, his hand going for his gun. He never made it. Daniel's bullet punched through his chest, sending him staggering back into the wall. Frank stepped in behind him, rifle barking, dropping another man before he could even draw. Shouts rang out, the room exploding into action. Daniel moved fast, using the overturned furniture for cover as bullets tore through the air. The bikers were caught off guard, scrambling to respond. One charged at him, a crowbar raised high. Daniel ducked, driving his shoulder into the man's gut before slamming his elbow into his jaw. The biker hit the ground hard, groaning. Another rushed Frank, but the old man was faster, pivoting smoothly and firing a clean shot through the attacker's knee. The biker dropped, screaming. Frank smirked. "Not so tough now." "Are ya?" Daniel barely heard him. His focus was locked on the hallway leading deeper into the cabin. Mace was here. He could feel it. He moved before Frank could stop him, pushing down the hall, his gun raised. A door at the end of the corridor burst open, and suddenly Mace was there, a shotgun in his hands. Daniel barely had time to dive aside as the blast tore through the wall where he had just been standing. Mace grinned. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" Daniel didn't answer. He fired 2 quick shots, forcing Mace to duck back into the room. The doorframe exploded as Mace returned fire, his laughter cutting through the smoke and chaos. "Come on, Briggs. You wanted this fight, right?" Daniel's breath was steady, his mind calm. He edged forward, staying low. He had hunted men before. The trick was patience. Let them think they had the upper hand. A shadow moved. Mace lunged from the doorway, swinging the shotgun like a club. Daniel barely dodged, the stock of the weapon grazing his ribs. He countered fast, his fist snapping forward, catching Mace across the jaw. The biker grunted but didn't go down. He swung again, this time catching Daniel across the face. Pain flared, but Daniel ignored it. He grabbed Mace's wrist, twisting hard, forcing the shotgun from his grip. The weapon clattered to the floor. They crashed into the wall, struggling, fists flying. Mace was strong, but Daniel was faster. He drove his knee into the biker's stomach, then slammed him against the wall. Mace spat blood, grinning through broken teeth. "That all you got?" Daniel pulled his gun, pressing it against Mace's temple. The biker's grin faltered. "You should have walked away," Daniel said, his voice flat. Mace's breath was ragged. "You won't do it." Daniel's finger tightened on the trigger. He wanted to, God, he wanted to, but something held him back. Not mercy, control. Killing Mace wouldn't end this war. It would only turn him into a martyr for whatever was left of his gang. Daniel exhaled sharply, shifting his grip. Instead of pulling the trigger, he slammed the gun across Mace's face, knocking him out cold. Frank appeared in the hallway, stepping over the bodies. "Took you long enough." Daniel rolled his shoulders, had to make sure he got the message. Frank glanced at Mace's unconscious form, then smirked. "Think he got it." Sirens wailed in the distance. Daniel turned, heading for the door. "Let's go." Frank followed without hesitation. They stepped into the night, the wind cool against their skin. The fight was over, but Daniel knew one thing for certain. He was never going back to the way things were. And the Iron Fangs. They would never forget the name Daniel Briggs. The night had stretched long and unforgiving, but the fight was over. Daniel could feel it in his bones, in the deep ache of his muscles, in the sting of every cut and bruise across his body. Mace lay unconscious on the cabin floor, his face bloodied, his body broken. The Iron Fangs were finished. Even the ones still breathing wouldn't dare try to rebuild, not after this, not after what they had just lost. Frank stood by the doorway, rifle resting against his shoulder, eyes sharp, despite the exhaustion settling into his frame. The distant wail of sirens was closing in, weaving through the trees like a hunter tracking prey. They had maybe 5 minutes, maybe less. "We should go," Frank muttered, stepping back toward the dark. Daniel exhaled slowly, nodding. He spared one last glance at Mace, at the man who had built an empire on fear and cruelty, reduced now to nothing more than a broken body in a wrecked hideout. There had been a time when Daniel would have thought justice would take care of him, when he would have believed Mace would pay for his crimes in a courtroom, not in a pool of his own blood. That time was long gone. He followed Frank into the woods, their movements swift and silent. slipping through the trees before the first flashing lights lit up the clearing behind them. They reached the truck, hidden just beyond the ridge, and climbed inside. The engine rumbled to life, and within seconds they were nothing more than another set of headlights disappearing down the old highway. The silence between them was thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of men who had fought, won, and now had to figure out what came next. Daniel stared out the window, watching the landscape blur past. "It's done," he said, though it felt strange to say it out loud. Frank snorted. "Ain't ever that simple, kid." Daniel turned toward him. "Mace is finished. The gang is done. What else is left?" Frank kept his eyes on the road, but his fingers tapped against the wheel. "You ever kill a snake, only to find out it had a nest?" Daniel frowned. "What are you saying?" Frank sighed. "I'm saying you took down the head of the beast, but that don't mean the fight's over. Mace was the kind of man who made enemies. You think he was just running this little gang by himself?" Daniel was quiet. Frank nodded. "That's what I thought." The weight in Daniel's chest settled heavier. He had wanted to believe this was the end, that after everything, after the blood and the bullets, he could walk away knowing Shadow was safe, that the town didn't have to fear the Iron Fangs anymore. But Frank was right. Nothing was ever that simple. They pulled into Daniel's driveway, the truck rolling to a stop. The house was dark except for the porch light, casting long shadows over the gravel. Frank shut off the engine, but didn't move. So what now? Daniel exhaled, staring at the house. "I don't know," Frank chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, ain't that something? A man spends his whole life fighting for something, then doesn't know what to do when it's over." Daniel smirked. "That's supposed to be wisdom," Frank shrugged. "Just an observation." Daniel opened the door and stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel. The cool night air wrapped around him, thick with the scent of earth and pine. Shadow and Ghost were waiting inside. He could feel them even before he opened the door. He turned back to Frank. "You coming in?" Frank leaned back in his seat. "Nah, think I'll sit here a while." Daniel studied him. "You ever think about leaving this town?" Frank smiled, the kind of smile that held years of ghosts behind it. "Left plenty of places in my time. Never did much good." Daniel nodded, understanding. He walked to the door, pushing it open. The warmth of the house greeted him, familiar, grounding. Shadow lifted his head from the couch, eyes locking onto him instantly. He let out a soft huff, as if scolding him for being gone too long. Daniel knelt beside him, running his hand over the dog's fur. "It's over, boy." Shadow blinked, unconvinced. Ghost lay curled up in the corner, still adjusting to his new life, still learning what it meant to be safe. Daniel reached out, scratching behind the younger dog's ears. Frank's voice drifted in from the truck. "It's never over, kid." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of it all settle in his bones. Maybe Frank was right. Maybe there was always another fight waiting on the horizon. But for now, at least for tonight, the war was done, and that was enough. The morning came slow, stretching across the town like a hesitant breath. Daniel hadn't slept much. He had sat on the porch with Shadow beside him, staring out at the empty road, waiting for something to happen, waiting for another sign that this wasn't over. But as the first light crept over the horizon, there was nothing. No rumbling motorcycles, no threats scrawled across his door. Just silence. Inside, Frank was awake too, sipping coffee at the kitchen table, his expression unreadable. Ghost lay curled by the door, still too skittish to join them in the open, but no longer flinching at every sound. That was progress. Daniel poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. "Think it's stuck?" Frank grunted. "I think we bought time." Daniel exhaled. He had hoped for something more final. But Frank was right. Mace was gone. The Iron Fangs were scattered. But the kind of power they had built didn't disappear overnight. The town had lived under their shadow for too long. Fear didn't just vanish because one man had fallen. He sipped his coffee, staring out the window. "People are going to ask questions." Frank smirked. "People are already asking." Daniel knew what he meant. He had seen the looks when he went into town. The wary glances from shopkeepers, the hushed conversations at the diner. The town had felt the shift, even if they didn't know all the details. Something had changed, something fundamental. The fear was still there, but beneath it, something else was stirring. Frank tapped his fingers against his mug. "You talked to Harris yet?" Daniel shook his head. "Not yet." Frank chuckled. "Man's probably climbing the walls wondering what the hell happened last night." Daniel had no doubt. Detective Harris had been fighting a losing battle against the Iron Fangs for years, tied down by bureaucracy and a department too stretched thin to do anything real about it. But now, with Mace out of the picture, things were different. Frank watched him for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. "You planning on telling him the whole truth?" Daniel's grip tightened on his mug. "I don't know." Frank smirked. "That's a no." Daniel didn't respond. He wasn't sure what Harris needed to hear. The official story would be a mess. Gunfire at the Iron Fangs hideout, Mace missing, bodies left behind. The police would find the wreckage and piece together what they could. But what really happened? The war that had played out in the dark? That wasn't something he could put in a report. Frank took another sip of coffee. "Well, whatever you tell him, just remember, some folks in this town are going to want to believe you did what needed doing." Daniel nodded. That was the thing about places like Brookhaven. People might not say it out loud, but they had been waiting for someone to push back, to remind them that this town didn't belong to men like Mace. A knock at the door made both men tense. Shadow lifted his head, ears perked, and Ghost let out a soft whine. Frank set his mug down. "That'll be him." Daniel exhaled and moved to the door, pulling it open. Harris stood on the porch, sunglasses on, hands resting casually in the pockets of his jacket. But Daniel could see the tension in his stance, the sharpness in his gaze. "Morning," Harris said, his tone unreadable. Daniel nodded. "Detective." Harris glanced past him, spotting Frank at the table. "You gonna invite me in?" Daniel stepped aside, letting him in. Harris scanned the room, taking in the scene. The dogs, the coffee, the air of exhaustion that still clung to both men. He didn't sit. Instead, he leaned against the counter, studying Daniel. "You want to tell me what the hell happened last night?" Daniel didn't blink. "Depends on what you already know." Harris exhaled sharply. "I know we got reports of gunfire at an Iron Fangs hideout. I know Mace is nowhere to be found, and I know half the gang skipped town before sunrise." He tilted his head. "That about line up with what you know?" Frank chuckled from the table. "Sounds about right." Harris shot him a look but didn't argue. Instead, he turned back to Daniel. "I don't suppose you had anything to do with that." Daniel met his gaze. "Do you really want me to answer that?" Harris studied him for a long moment, then sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "God damn it!" Daniel leaned against the wall. "You looking to make this official?" Harris shook his head. "No, I'm looking to make sure this town doesn't burn down." He straightened, crossing his arms. "You know this isn't over, right?" Daniel nodded. "I know." Harris exhaled. "You just made a lot of people nervous. Some are glad, some ain't. But either way, things don't just settle after a night like that." Frank smirked. "We'll manage." Harris looked between them, then sighed again. "Yeah, I bet you will." He pushed off the counter. "Just do me a favor. If anything else happens, I want to hear it from you first." Daniel nodded. "Fair enough." Harris studied him for another second, then nodded once and headed for the door. He paused before stepping out, looking back over his shoulder. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "some people in this town are gonna sleep easier now." Then he left. Frank let out a low whistle. "Well, that was almost a thank you," Daniel exhaled. He wasn't sure if he had expected Harris to push harder, to demand answers he wasn't ready to give. Maybe the detective understood that some things were better left unsaid. Outside, the sun was climbing higher, casting long shadows across the yard. The town was waking up. People would be stepping out of their homes, going about their routines, feeling the shift even if they didn't know exactly why. Frank stood, stretching. "So, what now?" Daniel looked down at Shadow and Ghost. The dogs were watching him, waiting, like they knew the answer before he did. He took a slow breath. We make sure this doesn't happen again. Frank grinned. That's what I like to hear. The war might have been over, but Daniel wasn't done fighting. Not yet. The days after the Iron Fangs fell were eerily quiet. The town of Brookhaven moved with an uneasy sort of peace, the kind that felt too delicate to last. The people sensed it, even if they didn't say it out loud. There was no grand announcement that Mace was gone, no official statement from the sheriff's department declaring victory, but people knew. They saw the empty bar where the gang once gathered. They noticed the absence of roaring motorcycles tearing through their streets. They felt the weight that had been lifted, but they also felt the lingering tension in the air. Frank and Daniel kept to themselves, staying mostly at the house, waiting to see if something would snap back. But nothing did. Harris had been right. Some people were glad, others weren't. The ones who had paid the Iron Fangs for protection were now stuck wondering if they'd be the next target. The ones who had lived in fear walked a little taller, unsure if it was safe to believe that things had truly changed. Daniel didn't care about any of that. He only cared about making sure no one tried to fill the vacuum Mace left behind. It wasn't long before people started showing up at his door. The first was James Holloway, the owner of the gas station just outside town. He had been one of the first to fall under Mace's thumb, paying them off so they wouldn't trash his place, so they wouldn't hurt his workers. Daniel had seen the man avoid eye contact every time he had walked in for coffee during a shift. Now, James stood on Daniel's porch, hat in hand, shifting from foot to foot like a man who wasn't sure if he should have come at all. Daniel didn't say anything at first, just watched him. James cleared his throat. I heard about what happened. Daniel leaned against the doorframe. Yeah? James hesitated, then nodded. People are talking. Some say you and that old bastard handled things. Others say the gang's just laying low. Daniel didn't respond. James exhaled sharply, glancing toward the road. I just wanted to say thanks. He looked back at Daniel. We needed this. Daniel nodded. Then don't let it happen again. James stiffened slightly, as if the words hit harder than he expected. Then he nodded and walked back to his truck without another word. The next visitor came the following afternoon. Deputy Kate Miller, one of the few in the sheriff's department who had always seemed willing to push back against the gang. She wasn't Harris, but she wasn't afraid either. She knocked once, then stepped back, hands on her hips, waiting. Daniel opened the door, taking her in. She had the look of someone who wanted answers, but already knew she wasn't going to get them. Sheriff wants to know if you plan on keeping your nose clean, she said. Daniel smirked. Depends on what you mean by clean. Kate sighed, glancing past him. I'm not going to pretend like we don't know what you did. Daniel said nothing. She exhaled, shifting on her boots. Look, the truth is, we should have handled this years ago, but we didn't, and now you did. So the way I see it, you've got two choices. You can either let this town get back to normal, or you can make things worse by picking fights that don't need picking. Daniel studied her. You think this is over? Kate's jaw tightened. I think it needs to be. Daniel crossed his arms. That's not up to me. Kate held his gaze for a moment, then sighed again. Harris is giving you space. That's his choice. But if more bodies start dropping, we're not going to look the other way forever. Daniel nodded. Understood. Kate hesitated. And Briggs? He raised a brow. She shifted, looking uncomfortable. We could use someone like you. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? She gave him a small smirk. The department could use someone who isn't afraid to get their hands dirty. Daniel scoffed. I think I've done enough of that. Kate tilted her head. Yeah? Then what are you planning to do now? Daniel didn't answer. She nodded to herself, as if that was the response she had expected. Just think about it. Then she turned and left. Frank was leaning against the porch railing, arms crossed. You should have asked if they'd let me wear a badge too. Daniel smirked. Not sure they're ready for that. Frank chuckled. Probably not. He studied Daniel for a moment. You actually thinking about it? Daniel shook his head. No. Frank didn't press. But the truth was, Daniel didn't know what he was going to do next. He had spent his life in the military, then in law enforcement, always serving something bigger than himself. When he had come back to Brookhaven, he had thought he was done with that. He had wanted a quiet life, a place where he could just exist. But now, after everything, he wasn't sure if that was even possible. The next week was slow, the days blending into one another. Daniel worked around the house, making repairs to the fence, reinforcing the windows. Not because he expected another attack, just because it kept his hands busy. People still came by, shop owners, ranchers, even a few younger men who had been on the fence about joining the gang, but now saw a different path. They all had the same question. What now? Daniel didn't have an answer for them, but Frank did. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned orange, Frank leaned back in his chair on the porch and said, "You ever trained men before?" Daniel frowned. "You know I have," Frank nodded. "Then maybe that's what you do next." Daniel raised a brow. "Train who?" Frank smirked. "This town ain't as safe as it should be, always someone waiting to take a piece of it. Maybe it's time we make sure the right people know how to fight back." Daniel considered that. He had spent his whole life training for war. Maybe it was time to train others for something else. He looked down at Shadow and Ghost, both dogs watching him, waiting. They had fought their own battles, survived their own wars, and now they were here, not running, not hiding, just ready. Maybe that was enough. Daniel exhaled, the tension in his chest easing just a little. He still didn't know what came next, but for the first time in a long time, he was willing to find out. The quiet never lasted. Not in Brookhaven, not in the kind of town where men like Mace had built their kingdom, in the dark corners of backroom deals and silent threats. Daniel had known it was only a matter of time before someone tried to take the Iron Fangs' place. The only question was who. The answer came one afternoon when Frank walked into the house with a look that said trouble was coming. He tossed an old manila envelope onto the table, the kind that usually carried bad news. Daniel picked it up, flipping it open. Inside were photographs, surveillance shots, a warehouse, a familiar one on the outskirts of town, the same one where they had found Shadow, where the Iron Fangs had first drawn their line in the sand. Except now, it wasn't abandoned. It was active. Daniel's stomach tightened. Frank leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Mace is gone, but his people ain't." Daniel flipped through the pictures. Men he didn't recognize. Some he did. A few of the bikers who had scattered after Mace's fall had found a new leader. That was no surprise. But what was? The man standing at the center of it all. Jared Cole. Daniel clenched his jaw. Frank nodded, as if he had read his mind. Yeah, that Cole. Jared Cole had once been Mace's right hand, the kind of man who handled things when Mace didn't want to get his hands dirty. He had been meaner than the others, crueler, a man who didn't just enforce orders but enjoyed them. Daniel had heard the stories, what Cole did to people who didn't pay, to those who tried to run. And now, with Mace out of the picture, he had decided he wasn't just the enforcer anymore. He was the new boss. Daniel exhaled, setting the envelope down. "How long?" Frank shrugged. "Not long, maybe a week, but they're moving fast. He's got the remaining fangs, and now he's bringing in outsiders. Word is, he's setting up new supply lines. Guns, drugs, the kind of things Mace was never stupid enough to push too hard in this town." Daniel stared at the photos, his pulse steady, cold. "Then we stop it." Frank smirked. "Knew you'd say that." They spent the next few hours gathering what they needed. Ammo, weapons, gear, the same things they thought they had put away for good. It was almost funny how fast you fell back into it. The old routines, the muscle memory, war never really left you. It just waited. By nightfall, they were ready. The warehouse was an old freight hub, the kind that had once been busy with shipments before the economy shifted, leaving it nothing but a skeleton of rusted steel and broken windows. It was the perfect place for men like Cole to operate, isolated, forgotten. They parked a quarter-mile out, moving on foot through the tall grass, their bodies low, silent. The night was thick, moonlight barely cutting through the cloud cover. Frank crouched beside a tree, scanning the perimeter through binoculars. 6 men outside. More inside. They're armed. He glanced at Daniel. This is gonna get messy. Daniel checked his rifle, chambering around. Let's make it fast then. They moved like ghosts, slipping through the shadows. The first guard didn't even see it coming. Daniel took him down with a sharp, silent strike, his body crumpling to the dirt. Frank handled the second, his knife flashing once, before the man went still. The others weren't as lucky. One of the bikers turned at the last second, eyes widening in alarm. "What the—" Daniel fired. The shot cracked through the night, cutting him off. Shouts erupted. Then the fight was on. Frank moved fast, his rifle kicking as he dropped another target. The remaining guards scrambled for cover, returning fire, but they weren't ready for this. They were thugs, not soldiers. Daniel pushed forward, weaving between stacks of old shipping crates. A bullet clipped the metal beside him, sending sparks flying. He ignored it, focused on the next target. A biker popped up from behind an oil drum, shotgun raised. Daniel didn't hesitate. 2 quick shots, center mass. The man went down. The rest ran. Frank exhaled, stepping over a body. "They weren't expecting us," Daniel nodded, "which means Cole is inside." They moved toward the entrance, stepping over scattered casings and bloodied dirt. The door was slightly open, light spilling onto the concrete. Daniel pushed through first, gun up. The inside of the warehouse was half filled with crates, the air thick with the smell of oil and sweat. At the far end of the room, Jared Cole stood waiting. He wasn't alone. 3 more bikers flanked him, their hands hovering near their guns, but they weren't firing. Not yet. Cole grinned. "Briggs." Daniel's grip on his weapon tightened. "Cole," the other man smirked, spreading his arms. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" Daniel took a slow step forward. "Neither did Mace. Look where that got him." Cole chuckled. "Yeah, I heard about that. Heard you tore through him like a goddamn war machine." He tilted his head. "That's what you are, isn't it?" Daniel didn't answer. Cole sighed, shaking his head. "See? I would have let you be. I'm not Mace. I don't care about petty grudges. But you went and made yourself a problem." He glanced at Frank. "And you brought the old bastard with you. Cute," Frank smirked. "You gonna talk us to death? Or we gonna get to the part where you make a mistake?" Cole's grin didn't falter. "Oh, I'm not the one making a mistake." He nodded to one of the men beside him. Daniel saw the movement too late. The biker yanked open a side door, and suddenly there were more of them. 6 men poured in, guns raised. Frank muttered, "Well, shit." Cole stepped back, hands in his pockets. "Told you. You can't win this." Daniel's mind worked fast. The angles, the numbers. This wasn't a fight they could win outright, unless they changed the rules. Frank caught his eye, nodding once. Then, without warning, he fired. The warehouse exploded into chaos. Daniel moved before the first bullet hit, diving for cover. Frank laid down fire, forcing the bikers to scatter. Cole was gone, slipping into the shadows. Daniel gritted his teeth, firing as he moved. A biker went down. Another staggered back, clutching his side. Frank shouted, "You got eyes on him?" Daniel scanned the room. "No!" Then, a flash of movement. Cole was running, heading for the back exit. Daniel took off after him. His boots pounded against the concrete, his breath steady despite the chaos behind him. He burst through the door, out into the night. Cole was almost to a truck. Daniel raised his gun. "Don't!" Cole froze, hands still on the door handle. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Cole chuckled. "You gonna kill me, Briggs?" Daniel exhaled. "No." Then he shot him in the knee. Cole screamed, collapsing onto the ground, clutching his leg. Daniel stepped closer, pressing the barrel of his gun to Cole's forehead. "You don't run this town anymore." Cole groaned, blood pooling beneath him. "You think this ends with me?" Daniel's voice was calm. "I don't care." He lowered the gun, stepped back. Frank jogged up, rifle still hot. He glanced down at Cole. "Guess we're done here." Daniel looked out at the empty road, at the town waiting beyond the trees. Not yet. Brookhaven had changed. The shift was subtle, but Daniel felt it in the way people moved, in the way conversations hushed when he walked into a room. The town had spent years under the thumb of the Iron Fangs, watching the gang tighten its grip like a slow-moving storm no one could outrun. Now, that storm had passed, but the damage remained. Fear didn't disappear overnight. The morning after Cole was taken out, Daniel stood in the doorway of the sheriff's office, staring at the badge pinned to the wall behind the front desk. He hadn't stepped inside this place in weeks, not since he had gone off the books and handled things his own way. Deputy Kate Miller looked up from behind the desk, her expression unreadable. "Thought you'd come in sooner," Daniel shrugged. "Didn't see a reason to?" Kate leaned back, studying him. "You do now?" He glanced at the bulletin board near the wall, wanted posters, reports, names of men who wouldn't be coming back. The Iron Fangs had been the worst of them, but they weren't the only ones. The town had more scars than just the ones Mace and Cole had left behind. He finally looked back at Kate. "That depends." She raised a brow. "On?" He hesitated. "What happens next?" Kate sighed, tapping a pen against the desk. "Sheriff's still waiting for the mess to settle before making a call. Harris is playing it careful. Some people are happy about what happened, some aren't. Some don't know what to think." Daniel nodded. "And you?" Kate didn't answer right away. She studied him for a long moment before saying, "I think the town's better off with you in it." The words sat heavy between them. Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. "I'm not a cop anymore, Kate." Kate smirked. "No, but you still act like one." Daniel turned, stepping back toward the door. "We'll see about that." As he walked out, the sunlight hit his face, warm against the cool autumn air. He had spent years following orders, then spent weeks breaking them. He wasn't sure where that left him. Frank was waiting by the truck, leaning against the hood with a cigarette in his hand. He watched as Daniel approached, his smirk already forming. "You finally going back to the right side of the law?" Daniel scoffed. "Not likely," Frank chuckled. "Yeah, figured." He took a drag of his cigarette, exhaling slow. "So, what's next?" Daniel glanced toward the road, toward the town stretching out before them. People were rebuilding, moving on, but something still felt unfinished. "I don't know yet," he admitted. Frank nodded. "That's all right. Men like us, we ain't built for standing still too long." Daniel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "There's still work to do." Frank smirked. "Then let's get to it." That night, Daniel sat on his porch, staring out at the empty road. The stars stretched wide above him, the world quiet in a way it hadn't been for weeks. Shadow lay at his feet, his ears twitching at every distant sound. Ghost was curled beside him, his breathing slow, steady. The dog had come a long way since the first night Daniel had found him, but the wariness was still there, buried deep. It would take time. Daniel reached down, running a hand over Ghost's fur. "Guess we've both got some figuring out to do, huh?" The dog didn't respond, just leaned into his touch. Frank stepped onto the porch, beer in hand. "You're doing it again." Daniel looked up. "Doing what?" Frank grinned. "Thinking too much." Daniel smirked. "You ever think about slowing down?" Frank took a sip of his beer, considering it. Not once. They sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the night settling around them. Finally, Daniel spoke. "I don't think it's over." Frank nodded. "It never is." Daniel looked back at the town. "Then we make sure the next fight doesn't happen." Frank grinned, raising his beer. "Now you're talking." Daniel didn't know where this road was leading, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to walk it. Whatever came next, he'd be ready, and Brookhaven would never be the same again. The town had started breathing again, but Daniel knew better than to believe the peace would last. It never did. Violence left echoes, and the things he had done, the things Frank had done, were rippling through Brookhaven in ways that hadn't fully settled yet. Some people had come out of their homes again, standing a little taller now that the Iron Fangs weren't looming over them. Some shopkeepers, like James Holloway, had started talking more freely, as if they had been given permission to exist without fear. But others still kept their heads down, still kept waiting, because they knew. Something else always came next. Frank had been watching the town too, though he pretended not to care. He sat on Daniel's porch most mornings now, sipping his coffee, looking out at the road like he was expecting trouble to roll in at any moment. Maybe he was. "You ever think about what's next?" Frank asked one morning, his voice carrying through the quiet. Daniel looked at him, then back at the town. "I think about what's not coming back." Frank smirked. "That's not the same thing." Daniel exhaled. "No, it's not." There was no going back to the way things had been. That much was clear, and while the Iron Fangs were gone, the space they left behind wasn't empty. Other threats lingered in the cracks, waiting to take shape, and if Daniel had learned anything over the last few weeks, it was that waiting for trouble meant letting it come on someone else's terms. The first sign of it came that afternoon when Harris showed up again. The sheriff's truck rolled up slow, dust kicking off the tires as he parked in front of the house. He climbed out, stretching his legs, his face unreadable behind his sunglasses. Daniel and Frank watched him from the porch, neither of them moving to greet him. Harris sighed, taking off his shades. "Would it kill you two to act like normal citizens?" Frank smirked. "Would it kill you to stop showing up uninvited?" Harris ignored him and looked at Daniel. "You got a minute?" Daniel stood, stepping down from the porch. "What's going on?" Harris glanced at Frank, then back at Daniel. "Let's take a walk." Daniel followed him toward the tree line, away from the house, away from any ears that might be listening. Harris walked slow, hands in his pockets, his shoulders tight with something unsaid. Finally he stopped, turning to face Daniel. "I know you think it's over." Daniel didn't respond. Harris let out a breath. "I got a report this morning. Some out-of-town bikers passing through, not Iron Fangs, new guys." Daniel's jaw tightened. "What do they want?" Harris studied him. "Not sure yet, but word is they're asking about Mace, about what happened to him." Daniel looked past him, out at the trees swaying in the wind. He had been expecting something like this. He just didn't know when. "They looking for revenge?" he asked. Harris shook his head. "I don't think so. More like they're looking to take what's left." Daniel exhaled. "That's not happening." Harris nodded. "I didn't think you'd say anything else." Silence stretched between them for a moment. Then Harris shifted, looking uncomfortable. "Look, I know I gave you space. I know the department didn't ask too many questions about what happened out there, but I can't keep looking the other way if bodies start dropping again." Daniel met his gaze. "Then let me handle it before that happens." Harris studied him for a long time, then sighed. "Just keep it clean, Briggs." He turned to leave but stopped before climbing back into his truck. "And if something goes sideways, you tell me first." Daniel nodded. "You have my word." Harris gave him one last look, then pulled away, his truck disappearing down the road. Frank walked up beside Daniel, watching the dust settle. "New players?" Daniel nodded. Frank sighed, rubbing his jaw. "Told you snakes have nests." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Then we make sure this one doesn't hatch." By nightfall, they had a plan. The newcomers were staying at a rundown motel just outside town, the kind of place where people disappeared without anyone asking questions. Daniel and Frank parked a few lots down, watching the bikes lined up outside. "How many?" Frank asked, scanning the lot through binoculars. Daniel counted. 5 bikes. Could be more inside." Frank set the binoculars down. "So what's the approach? Walk up and introduce ourselves?" Daniel smirked. "Something like that." They moved across the lot fast, sticking to the shadows. The motel was old, the neon sign flickering above them. Daniel knocked on the door of the first room. Silence. Then the click of a gun being cocked. Daniel stepped aside just as the door flew open, a man lunging forward with a pistol raised. Frank moved first, slamming the barrel of his rifle against the man's wrist, sending the gun flying. Before the guy could react, Daniel grabbed him by the collar and drove him into the wall. The man gasped, struggling, but Daniel pressed harder. "Who are you?" The man gritted his teeth. "Go to hell." Frank sighed. "Wrong answer." He slammed the rifle butt into the man's stomach, and he crumpled to the ground, wheezing. Daniel crouched beside him. "I'll ask again. Who are you, and what are you doing here?" The man spat blood onto the pavement. "We heard there was an opening." Daniel's jaw tightened. "There's not." The man let out a weak chuckle. "That's not your call." Frank kicked him in the ribs. I think it is, the man groaned, clutching his side. Look, man, we don't care about Mace. He was an idiot. We just want the business. Daniel's grip tightened. There is no business, the man coughed. That's not how this works. There's always someone next in line. Frank glanced at Daniel. He's not wrong. Daniel exhaled. He had spent so much time thinking about taking down the Iron Fangs, about ending what they built, that he hadn't considered what came after. The man on the ground chuckled again. You think you can just wipe out a gang and nothing fills the space? He grinned through bloody teeth. You ain't that naive. Daniel's hands clenched. Frank knelt beside the man, grabbing him by the hair and yanking his head up. You go back to your people. You tell them this town is closed. The man's smirk faded. Frank leaned closer. And if any of them step foot in Brookhaven again, we bury them under it. The man swallowed hard. Frank let go, standing. Get lost. The man didn't hesitate. He scrambled to his feet and ran, disappearing into the night. Frank dusted off his hands. That was fun. Daniel exhaled, his mind working. This isn't over. Frank smirked. Nope, but we sure as hell made a statement. Daniel looked out at the empty road. The town was waking up, but its past hadn't fully let go. He had set something in motion, and now he had to see it through. Whatever came next, he would be ready, because this town was never going back to the way it was. The morning after the motel incident, Brookhaven felt different. The air was still, the streets quieter than usual. It wasn't fear, not like it had been before, but something else. A pause, a breath before the next move. Daniel stood in front of his house, watching the town wake up. He had spent years living by rules, by laws, by the belief that structure held things together. That had been stripped away piece by piece, and now he was standing in a place he didn't recognize anymore. Not because the town had changed, but because he had. Frank stepped onto the porch, sipping coffee, his expression unreadable. You know they'll come back. Daniel nodded. I know. Frank smirked. You ready for that? Daniel looked down at Shadow and Ghost. The two dogs sat side by side, watching the road like sentinels, waiting just like him. I think I am, Daniel said finally. Frank chuckled. Well, damn. That almost sounded confident. Daniel turned, giving him a look. Almost. Frank grinned. We'll see. The quiet didn't last long. By mid-morning, word had spread. The newcomers from the motel had packed up and left, disappearing down the highway before the sun had fully risen. Some people in town noticed, some didn't, but those who did knew exactly why. James Holloway was one of them. The gas station owner showed up before noon, standing awkwardly on Daniel's porch like he wasn't sure he had the right to be there. Daniel leaned against the railing. Something I can do for you, James. James shifted, rubbing the back of his neck. Heard what you did. Daniel didn't answer. James cleared his throat. I just wanted to say, some of us appreciate it. Daniel nodded. Good. James hesitated. There's talk. People wondering what's going to happen next. Daniel studied him. What do you think? James exhaled. I think people need to know they won't have to live like they used to, that they don't have to be afraid of who's in charge. Daniel nodded slowly. Then let's make sure they don't. James blinked. What does that mean? Daniel pushed off the railing. It means we don't wait for trouble anymore. Frank, who had been listening from the doorway, smirked. Now you're talking my language. That night, Daniel and Frank made their rounds. Not as lawmen, not as enforcers, but as something in between. They spoke to business owners, to the people who had spent too long keeping their heads down. They didn't make promises. They didn't tell lies. They just let people know that Brookhaven belonged to its people again, and if anyone tried to change that, they'd answer for it. By the time the sun set, the town had begun to settle into its new reality. The Iron Fangs were gone. The threats that had loomed over them were scattered, but the scars would take longer to fade. Daniel sat on his porch that evening, Shadow resting at his feet, Ghost curled up nearby. The weight in his chest had eased, but it hadn't disappeared. It never really did. Frank dropped into the chair beside him, cracking open a beer. You ever think about leaving? Daniel exhaled. I did, Frank nodded. But you're still here. Daniel glanced at the road, at the houses lining the street, at the town that had once been something to run from and now felt like something worth standing for. I guess I am. Frank chuckled. Well, damn. Maybe you're finally starting to belong here. Daniel smirked. Maybe. The night stretched on, quiet, peaceful. For the first time in a long time, Daniel let himself believe it might stay that way. And if it didn't, well, he'd be ready.